This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we continue on the 5th presidential primary debate, Democrat, in Atlanta, Georgia.
We're now joined for a roundtable on last night's debate. In Washington, D.C., we have Phyllis Bennis, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and author of several books, including Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer. In Berkeley, California, Gabriel Zucman is with us. He's professor of economics at UC Berkeley and the co-author of The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. And in Atlanta, Georgia, we're joined by Ryan Grimm, the Washington D.C. bureau chief for The Intercept, who was at the debate last night.
And here in New York City, Rashad Robinson is with us, president of Color of Change. His latest piece for The Nation headlined, "Forget about plans, which candidate can get things done?" Let's begin with former Vice President Joe Biden speaking last night.
I'm part of that Obama coalition. I come out of the black community in terms of my support. If you notice, I have more people supporting me in the black community that have announced for me because they know me. They know who I am. 3 former chairs of the Black Caucus, the only African-American woman that ever been elected to the United States Senate, a whole range of people.
No,
my point is,
that's not true. The other one is here.
I said the first. I said the first African-American elected. First African-American. So my point is...
Senator Kamala Harris is putting her hands up, and she's the one who corrects him. No, you don't have the support of your rival, right, Senator Harris. What are you talking about, Rashad Robinson? Can you explain what happened there?
You know, I think it's always tricky when white folks try to out-black black folks. And I think Biden would do himself a favor at looking what Bill Clinton did back in 2007 and 2008 in South Carolina, where he sort of talked about his history and support with the black community to undermine the insurgent candidacy of President Obama at the time. And folks began to turn on him and began to push back on that. Hillary Clinton enjoyed a lot of support back then from a wide range of black folks. But what she enjoyed and what Biden enjoys is a lot of support from insiders, from the establishment, from folks that are looking at sort of the calculation and think that this is the candidate that white people will accept and white people will vote for. And as we get closer and closer to Election Day, if Biden is not willing to consolidate support, we're gonna see people moving away, and we already see that in terms of young black folks, in terms of the activist community, and many others that just simply don't think that Biden has the range. And he hasn't been there. He hasn't showed up. Biden is the only candidate that we have not been able to get a sit-down meeting with. It's absolutely outrageous that we have reached out multiple times, and it's almost like a joke now with his folks where they say, oh, well, maybe, well, sort of. And I can't even think of any next generation black leader or organization in the movement right now that's had a sit-down conversation with Joe Biden. If this is what he does when we're dating, what's going to happen if we marry? This is actually a really big problem. If he's not willing to sit down and have conversations, to hear from us about our priorities, then we've got a lot of concerns about what the future looks like.
Well, let's go to an exchange between Senator Kamala Harris and South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. This is co-moderator Kristen Welker.
Senator Harris, this week you criticized Mayor Pete Buttigieg's outreach to African-American voters. You said, quote, the Democratic nominee has got to be someone who has the experience of connecting with all of who we are as the diversity of the American people, end quote. What exactly prompted you to say that, Senator Harris?
Well, that was asked a question that related to a stock photograph that his campaign published. But listen, I think that it really speaks to a larger issue, and I'll speak to the larger issue. I believe that the mayor has made apologies for that. The larger issue is that for too long, I think, candidates have taken for granted constituencies that have been the backbone of the Democratic Party and have overlooked those constituencies. And and have, they show up when it's, close to election time and show up in a black church and want to get the vote, but just haven't been there before.
Mayor Buttigieg, your response to that?
My response is I completely agree. And I welcome the challenge of connecting with black voters in America who don't yet know me. And before I share what's in my plans, let me talk about what's in my heart and why this is so important. As mayor of a city that is racially diverse and largely low income, for 8 years, I have lived and breathed the successes and struggles of a community where far too many people live with the consequences of racial inequity that has built up over centuries but been compounded by policies and decisions from within living memory.
So that's South Bend Mayor Pete speaking last night at the debate. Ryan Grimm of The Intercept, you were there and you've written a lot about the mayor. Your response to what he said and his performance last night?
Well, it was interesting that Kamala Harris decided to kind of take a pass on coming directly at Mayor Buttigieg in that exchange. And nobody else really came at him throughout the entire debate. I think he was prepared for an onslaught, given that there have been recent polls showing him up in New Hampshire and Iowa, and normally the front runner gets piled on. That may have been delayed until the next debate. What she was referring to as a stock photo was related to a broader controversy over the way that he presented what's known as his Douglas plan for Black America. This is the primary piece of outreach that he has to the Black community. And when he rolled it out, yes, it was kind of funny that he used a stock photo from a Kenyan woman and her little brother to kind of promote the project for Black America. But more damaging to him, and which Harris did not get into, is that he listed 400 supporters of this plan, the top 3 of whom were leaders of the Black community in South Carolina. After it came out, they told The Intercept, two of them, Johnny Cordero, who is the chairman of the South Carolina Black Caucus, said, I explicitly told them I do not endorse this plan, and they used my name anyway. State Representative Ivory Thigpen said the same thing. He explicitly told them that he was not endorsing the Douglas plan, and they put his name on it anyway. He, in fact, is the co-chair of the Bernie Sanders campaign in South Carolina. The third endorser said, I told them that it was okay to use my name for the Douglas plan, but I said, please don't make it look like I'm endorsing your candidacy. And she felt like they were intentionally vague in the way they rolled it out to make it look like they had done that. And it's very difficult to imagine a politician doing that sort of thing to a white state senator in Iowa or New Hampshire, for instance. It's really difficult to imagine that happening to any community other than the Black community in American politics. And so Harris pivoted to a conversation about what is your authentic connection with the Black community. And Booker also hit later on a related point, which is if you can't bring together the Obama coalition. And that was kind of a code for bringing together white progressives, LGBT community, and the Black community together, and immigrant community together into that coalition that's able to get more than 50% of the vote. If you can't make that entire coalition whole, you're going to fall short. But they didn't kind of name him when they were making that argument.
Now, Rashad Robinson, I mean, the significance of this, because you have Mayor Pete now polling #1 in one of the whitest states in the country, Iowa. #1, he's jumped something like, if you believe the polls, roughly 10% against Warren, Sanders, and Biden, which is why everyone was going after him last night, yet polling at almost 0 within the Black community.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some time to talk with Mayor Pete and, and really have pushed him. I don't even understand why he named his plan the Douglas plan. Like, can you explain, is Frederick Douglass someone that is really inspiring to you? Why? What is your relationship with the community? I think, the problem that Mayor Pete has is that he comes across as a very good student, someone who is deeply studied and can understand issues, but doesn't have a context oftentimes or a story to back it up. And people realize that and recognize that. He is a millennial who does not have right now black friends out there talking about him, and that's worrisome.
Well, explain what happened in South Bend, Indiana during his campaign, the killing of an African-American person there.
Absolutely. The killing, both the police killing and the ongoing way that he's had problems with police community tension, the firing of the black police chief who was working to expose racism in the force. This is someone who's had deep challenges with racial justice in a relatively small city that most people probably can't point to on the map, who now wants to be president of the United States. Racial justice is not a side piece. It's not charity. And while it is moral, it is actually strategy. It's a strategy to actually win. And it's a force multiplier for the type of change that we need on our side to get people mobilized out to the polls to expand the base. If a candidate actually does not have the type of relationship where people feel like they're known, like they're going to actually be engaged and they're going to be prioritized, then they're not going to show up in big numbers. And I think the challenge for Mayor Pete is that the Douglas plan on paper seems like a lot of
course,
good...
named for Frederick Douglass.
Named for Frederick Douglass. Seems like a lot of good information. I've read through it. I've talked to him about it. But there is no story or context behind it. There's also not a history of him implementing it and executing it. And with all of these candidates, I am not interested, and folks are not as interested in the what, but the how. What is your experience and your relationship to movements to actually getting this done? We have a history, hundreds of years of stalled progress of inequality on race issues in this country. And we need someone that actually has experience, the ability to mobilize people and the ability to move people. And we need to know that it's a priority, not something that you have to do to check off a box. He still has some work to do in that regard.
We're going to break and then come back to discuss this fifth Democratic presidential debate that took place in Atlanta, Georgia. Stay with us.
So let me just tell you what we can do with that 2-cent wealth tax. 2 cents on the top 1/10 of 1% in this country, and we can provide universal child care for every baby in this country aged 0 to 5. That is transformative. We can provide universal pre-K for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old in America. We can stop exploiting the women, largely black and brown women, who do this work, and we can raise the wages of every child care worker and preschool teacher in America. We can put $800 billion new federal dollars into all of our public schools. We can make college tuition free for every kid. We can put $50 billion into historically black colleges and universities, and we can cancel student loan debt for 95% of the folks who've got it. 2-cent wealth tax, and we can invest in an entire generation's
let me
future.
let Senator Booker respond.
Sure.
Again, I agree with the need to do all of those things. We're all united in wanting to see universal preschool, and I'll fight for that. We're all united in wanting to fund HBCUs. Heck, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for 2 parents that went to HBCUs. But the tax, the way we're putting it forward right now, the wealth tax, I'm sorry, it's cumbersome. It's been tried by other nations. It's hard to evaluate. We can get the same amount of revenue through just taxation.
So that's Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker at last night's debate. I'd like to bring Gabriel Zucman into the conversation, professor of economics at Berkeley and co-author of the new book, The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. So, Gabriel, your response to Elizabeth Warren's tax plan and Cory Booker's criticism of it?
Yeah, well, first, I think it's fascinating to see the shift in the conversation about taxes among Democrats. For a very long time, they were reluctant, most of them, to talk about more progressive taxation, to talk about taxing billionaires in particular. And now we have these proposals about wealth taxation that are endorsed by major candidates. Elizabeth Warren is one example. Bernie Sanders also supports a wealth tax. In both cases, these are very progressive taxes, starting very high in the wealth distribution, above $50 million for Warren, with a rate as high as 6%, above $1 billion as high as 8%, above $10 billion in the Sanders plan. So this is a dramatic departure and a major change that I welcome in the conversation. And of course, there is some pushback, and we heard Senator Booker pushing back on the idea of wealth taxation. My answer to that is, I've studied the European experience with wealth taxation, and it's true that it's been largely a failure, but this is for preventable reasons. I think the US is in a much stronger position to make a wealth tax work today. For instance, if you are a rich French person, you could avoid the wealth tax by moving to Belgium or to moving to a low-tax country anywhere else in Europe. If you're a wealthy American, you cannot avoid taxes by moving abroad because the taxes follow you. Taxation is based on citizenship. So there's not this problem of tax competition, for instance. The US does much more to fight tax evasion and could do even more in the future than European countries have been doing. Many wealthy Europeans used to hide assets and still do in banks in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in similar tax havens. The US is a bit more aggressive when it comes to trying to collect information from these tax havens. And one last thing, there is this notion that wealth taxes are cumbersome or very hard to implement because it's hard to value assets. But it is not quite true, because when you look at the wealth of these very wealthy individuals who would be affected by the wealth taxes, about 75% of their wealth is invested in listed securities, in equities, bonds, mutual fund shares that have well-defined, well-measured market values. And so it's actually pretty easy to tax these very wealthy Americans, potentially quite progressively.
And Gabriel Zucman, I wanted to ask you about that recent Guardian piece you wrote. Make no mistake, Medicare for All would cut taxes for most Americans. The way the corporate media and the moderators, the questioners in general through these debates ask about issues like Medicare for All is by saying, are you going to increase taxes? Explain what the cost would be, and in fact, how people would actually save money.
Yes, that's a very important question, and that's something that's still not very well understood, I feel, among the public. So what's very important to understand is that the way that healthcare is funded today when it comes to employer-provided healthcare is already through what you could call a big private tax, which is that employers have to pay private insurance companies to cover their workers, and that's mandatory, essentially, and it's a huge cost. It's about $13,000 per worker, and the cost is the same no matter what the wage of the employee is. That is, it's $13,000 for a secretary and for an executive. So if there was a transition to Medicare for All, here is what could happen. You could imagine that employers would be forced to convert the premiums that they currently pay to insurance companies into wages. So for them, it would make no difference. For workers, it would make a huge difference because their wage would increase essentially by $13,000, which would be the biggest pay raise in a generation for the vast majority of Americans. And then, of course, taxes would have to increase to pay for Medicare for All, but with smart taxes based on income or wealth or taxes on corporate profits, it's very easy to make sure that for most workers, the extra taxes would be much less than the gain in wage, this $30,000 wage increase, so that the net take-home pay, the increase in take-home pay, would be again the biggest increase in a generation for 90% of workers.
And of course, it would increase access to health care for everyone. I want to turn to foreign policy right now. This is Senator Bernie Sanders speaking about the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia.
I think I may have been the first person up here to make it clear that Saudi Arabia not only murdered Khashoggi, but this is a brutal dictatorship which does everything it can to crush democracy, treats women as third-class citizens. And when we rethink our American foreign policy, what we have got to know is that Saudi Arabia is not a reliable ally. We have got to bring Iran and Saudi Arabia together in a room under American leadership and say we are sick and tired of us spending huge amounts of money and human resources because of your conflicts. And by the way, the same thing goes with Israel and the Palestinians. It is no longer good enough for us simply to be pro-Israel. I am pro-Israel. But we must treat the Palestinian people as well with the respect and dignity that they deserve. What is going on in Gaza right now, where youth unemployment is 70 or 80%, is unsustainable. So we need to be rethinking who our allies are around the world, work with the United Nations, and not continue to support brutal dictatorships.
So that's Senator Bernie Sanders at last night's presidential primary debate. Phyllis Bennis is with us, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, has written a number of books, including Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Phyllis, your response to the foreign policy section of the debate, it wasn't that long, but it took in a lot of issues, and it looks like Bernie Sanders dared to talk about Israel-Palestine.
Bernie Sanders was indeed the only one who talked directly about Israel-Palestine. What I think was interesting, there was some good news and bad news, in a sense, if we look at the foreign policy debate overall. The good news is that there's starting to be, it's other than Bernie Sanders and to some degree Elizabeth Warren, there's not a lot yet, but there's a growing recognition among the candidates that the base of the Democratic Party, the discourse has changed dramatically across the board on the Middle East. So that questions of recognizing that Saudi Arabia is not our trusted ally against terrorism or something, but is a brutal dictatorship, is now a widespread view, even from the centrist sector of the Democratic Party. People like Klobuchar and Biden both said that. What's missing, and this is where we get into the problematic part, what's missing from this shift is that there's not a lot of discussion about what would that mean. Bernie Sanders' comments about Saudi Arabia and the need for diplomacy between bringing together, as he put it, Saudi Arabia and Iran was the one very specific and very innovative notion of replacing war and threat of war with diplomacy. But there's not a lot of that kind of discussion about how would this happen. In the past, Elizabeth Warren has very importantly given a number on the question of how much money would you cut from the military budget. In her proposal around Medicare for All, she proposed cutting $80 billion from the military budget, which is huge. No other candidate, and virtually no one else in Congress, has given those kinds of specific numbers yet about what they would be willing to cut, to pay for big, bold new proposals like the Green New Deal, like Medicare for All. In this debate, when there was discussion about the Green New Deal, discussion about health care, it didn't come up in connection. We didn't see that intersectional relationship between one of the places we can get money is from the military budget. There was a very extensive discussion from Elizabeth Warren about the $800 billion, which is a very important figure that she has put forward on a number of occasions in terms of the wealth tax and how that could be used for health care. The same thing is true across the board for other candidates on the question of cutting the military budget. In fact, in June, when the Poor People's Campaign convened a candidates forum, there were 9 members of the pool of candidates who were there, including all the major candidates, and 7 of the 9 were asked, would you cut the military budget? Every single one said yes. The other 2 were not asked just by chance. One of those 2, ironically, was Bernie Sanders, who has perhaps most consistently talked about cutting the military budget. But the problem was the questions from the the journalists asking the questions didn't include, you've all said you would cut the military budget. Now the question has to be, how much? My colleagues at the National Priorities Project have put together the numbers where these cuts can come from. We could cut $66 billion just by ending the Pentagon's war slush fund. We could cut $112 billion by cutting just 75% of the 800 overseas military bases. So there's a way to do this. There's a way to do this and to make it real. And that's what we're not hearing yet from the candidates. They're recognizing that the discourse is changing and they have to catch up, but they haven't caught up sufficiently. They're not listening to the movements. They're not listening even to the polls in which people in the Democratic Party and more broadly are all calling for cutting the military budget.
We want to bring in a person who wasn't standing on the stage in Atlanta last night, but clearly there every step of the way, and that's Barack Obama, former president. Want to talk about his comments last week at a fundraising event. He said, quote, even as we push the envelope and we're bold in our vision, we also have to be rooted in reality. The average American doesn't think we have to completely tear down the system and remake it. I don't think we should be deluded into thinking that the resistance to certain approaches to things is simply because voters haven't heard a bold enough proposal. And if they hear something as bold as possible, then as immediately that's going to activate them. Ryan Grim, the significance of, he basically was saying that the party, he was warning the party about going too left.
Right, and because the Democratic Party, and by that I also mean kind of the base of it, the voters, have refused to kind of reckon with the Obama administration in an honest way, he remains able to kind of dictate the direction of the conversation. Nobody on stage is willing to come after Obama specifically, and it not only allows Biden to tie himself to his record, but it allows Obama to make these interventions. If you notice in the debate last night, even Tulsi Gabbard, who is more willing than probably anybody on that stage to specifically come after the Democratic Party, said that a Kamala Harris administration would just be an extension of a Bush, Clinton, Trump foreign policy. She very specifically flinched at putting Obama
Ryan,
into
we want to give Rashad the last
category,
word. Ryan,
even though
you just
I
have 10 seconds.
She believes that he belongs there.
The quick thing is, I was in the room when that happened. Most of the people in the room were donors. Obama also said one other thing that I think all of us have to remember is that he wished he had put more money into state infrastructure to actually get other people elected. Obama was very good at electing himself.